Thanks again, everyone, for joining me for another one of my interviews. Today, I'm interviewing once again Dr. Jordan Wood, who I find endlessly fascinating. And so this is Dr. Wood Part 2. And we're going to be discussing today a topic that we kind of ended our first video with. We were discussing at the end of our first video universalism. And I know that I get a lot of correspondence and emails from people who watch and read my blog. I tell you, readership goes off the charts whenever I talk about David Hart, universalism. The com box fills up, and there you go. And so they're always after me. Talk about this some more. Talk about this some more. So we're talking about it some more now. I introduced Dr. Wood before, but I'll give it a brief introduction again. Dr. Wood got his PhD at Boston College, and he specializes in the thought of St. Maximus the Confessor, someone near and dear to both of our hearts, and was Hans Louis von Balthasar was a big fan, if you want to put it that way, of Maximus the Confessor as well. And he has a couple of books on Maximus that are about to hit the fan, one with University of Notre Dame Press and one with Catholic University of America Press. So before we go on, Dr. Wood, when are those books coming out?
Well, so the first one with Notre Dame, they had said October 15th, but I was getting screenshots just yesterday of people already receiving the book. So apparently they've already sent it out. There you go.
Well, and what is the title of the book?
So that book is The Whole Mystery of Christ, Creation as Incarnation, and Maximus Confessor. The one with the Catholic University of America is a volume for the Fathers of the Church series, and that's still probably a few years out, but I'm translating all of Maximus's letters into English for the first time as a whole. So,
ooh, I wish I had your language skills. I'm so typically American in that regard. I know just enough Hebrew, Latin, Greek, German, French to be mildly dangerous, and to do scholarly work. You know, I could pick up something from Aquinas or Augustine and read it in Latin with a dictionary.
Yes, yeah.
but not in any way that I would trust on a scholarly level. So, I have no pride in that regard. I'm typically American. I struggle with languages. And although I did have to read Balthasar in German for my dissertation, so my German skills at one time were good. But anyway, God bless you for your translational efforts.
Thank
All right,
you.
so let's and so, by the way, if people wanted to order the book you made, The Full Mystery of Christ, if they went on Amazon right now, they could probably find it.
Yeah, they could find it right now, and of course Notre Dame's website. Yeah, and it looks like it's ready to go. It's shipping out. So.
And the royalties will be rolling in, and you'll be able to retire to a South Pacific island.
Pretty soon, I'm going to have a beautiful shoji screen behind me that's custom made. So watch out.
You know, that screen you have behind you, I've seen some David Bentley Hart videos, and he's got that same screen behind him, it seems. I should invest in one of those, maybe.
You should. I mean, it hides all the ugliness behind. So.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, universalism. For our viewers, of course, universalism is the doctrine that eventually all souls, all persons will be saved, that they will all find ultimately union with God in heaven, that no one will be eternally damned to hell. And there are various iterations of universalism, of course. It first shows up in the church's tradition, most famously with the theologian Origen, who was or was not condemned for it. Who the heck knows? You know, all the scholarship goes back and was Origen an Origenist or not, and blah, blah, blah. But it sort of shows up there, and it shows up again and again and again in various fathers of the church, Gregory of Nyssa, most famously. One of the problems with adjudicating how many church fathers actually embraced universalism, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the early church, is that you take someone like a Maximus or even like a Gregory of Nyssa, you can tell that they're universalists, but they seem to have held the view that you should keep that quiet because you don't want to spout that everyone's going to be saved, lest the great unwashed, uneducated masses take that as a green light to live a life of moral licentiousness. Mm-hmm. And so they said, well, the great masses, the hoi polloi, need a doctrine of eternal hell in order to walk the straight line. And that's an issue perhaps we can address down the road. But anyway, then, of course, in the history of the 20th century and even before that, there are theologians here and there that pop up. And David Bentley Hart, and then I'll give you a chance to talk here since you're the guest. David Bentley Hart, of course, believes in hell.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Hart's book is That All Shall Be Saved, a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. Hart believes in hell, and he believes that people go there. He just doesn't believe it's eternal. It's more purgative for him. And so it's wrong to say that David Hart doesn't believe that people go to hell. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to correct something from our first video with regard to Hart's book. After I spoke last time, I got an email from David, and he said, "Hey, you and the way only David can do. Hey, you got it wrong, moron." He didn't say moron, but you get my point. And I said that, according to Hart, given the anthropology of Thomas, that our wills are naturally oriented towards the good, that no person could ever, for all eternity, resist the divine goodness. Hence, everyone will be saved. But Hart said that's actually an incorrect interpretation of his position, and I want to correct it now. His view, is, of course, is that the sinner, precisely because they're a sinner, has such a diminished freedom that they cannot really make a totally free choice for or against God, that it's impossible for them. And so then that's why then hell becomes a purgative thing, that those sins that are within them that are clouding their judgment and occluding their judgment and hindering their free will are purged. And then they are allowed to pass into the presence of God. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing his view yet again. So, David, if I have, my apologies. I'm hoping to interview David Hart soon. He agreed to it, but then hasn't really gotten back to me with a date. So we'll go from there. Anyway, what say ye about universalism? Let's just open it up, and you can sort of riff on what I've just said or say something that you want to add. So go ahead.
Well, so I think a few things just in terms of riffing on what you said. One, I think you're right that in terms of the patristic perspectives and different patristic authors and whether or not they're a universalist and what kind and to what degree, you rightly noted that there is a hesitation among some of them about just baldly declaring such a position without a lot of nuance or qualification, and that can sort of encourage moral laxity or spiritual laxity. Because, and I hear this all the time, and I'm sure you do too, where it's like, well, if universalism is true, it's sort of like, who cares what you do? None of our decisions are ultimately weighty and useful or like significant. They're not meaningful, and it's sort of unfair, which sometimes get into the territory of like, let's recall some of the parables of Jesus about the worker who arrives at the 11th hour and how everyone else is grumbling and how it sort of seems unfair, and grace is sort of unfair in that perspective. Which reminds me of something that another very explicit Universalist church father, St. Isaac of Nineveh, once said. He says, after Christ, justice is no more, there's only mercy. Now, of course, he doesn't mean, right, that you don't treat people fairly or whatever. And that's another point, right, we could maybe talk about later, is that the Universalist position, it isn't, we need to take it out of the context of simply what verdict do you get handed in the last judgment. Like, what category are you in? Because then it does seem unfair. Like, at the end, you get a get out of jail free card, and that's what universalism is. And so that's not fair. Well, no, in the end, you get exactly what you need to be perfect. And that is different for everyone.
And nobody gets what they deserve. Thank God.
Exactly. Right. So, and another point about the patristic perspective that I'd throw in there is there's also, I do think this is with us even now. There's also a sense in which some of them, I'm thinking particularly of the correspondence of Barsanuphius and John, who received this from a novice. They're abbots in like Palestinian monasteries. They received this inquiry, which I think I get the sense happened not infrequently. A monk novice is reading Gregory of Nyssa and some of Gregory Nazianzus, and they're like, wow, this is sort of sounding like apokatastasis. Like, is this... surely St. Gregory can't be teaching this as explicitly as it seems to be. And so this novice raises the question with Barsanuphius. And, the initial response, which in one way I understand as a kind of monastic mentality, was, well, hold on a second. Why are you even asking this question? He says, are you perhaps idle? Like, are you just sort of, what are you doing? Like, why are you so there's also a sense in which some people depict something like a verdict or a position on God's final judgment as prying into what is God's prerogative alone, which would be his own final judgment, and that almost like the vice of curiosity could be the only thing motivating such a vigorous search and a storming of the gates of heaven to find out who is there and who's not. And so there is that perspective too. So there's the moral laxity issue of, well, if word gets around and it's kind of in an unnuanced way, this might encourage misunderstandings. But then there's also the sense of like, is it good for you spiritually to be prying into eschatological matters that are more or less beyond our kin? And I would submit, and then I can sort of pass back to you, see where you want to go. I think, especially that latter question. I mean, I think both questions are with us today, and they motivate objections and worries over universalism. But I also think that the second one really gets at a certain caricature of universalist thinkers that is worth demolishing, which is that they really are just taking a position on something called eschatology, which is this more or less arid intellectual enterprise, and it's just a bunch of talking heads squabbling about the details of things, puffed up with pride, right? As if that's the only motivator here is pride, and I think that would be to gravely misunderstand, thinkers like Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Isaac of Nineveh, George MacDonald, David Hart, whoever. I think that's misunderstood. I'm not saying there aren't those out there that treat it that way,
Yeah.
but I think it would be to misunderstand it. For me, it's a much more existential question. The eschatological and the existential in this way, or on like in this topic, are kind of maybe perhaps uniquely joined together, and I think that might explain some of the interest that we experience even now today around this topic and some of the energy around it.
Yes, I agree. And to go back to this, then the question of, why be morally good? If everybody goes to heaven eventually anyway, I think you've addressed a lot of the sort of the vice of curiosity and all that goes, idleness and all that goes with it. I also think there's some powerful misunderstandings there, not just about what you need to do to get to heaven, or what heaven is, what eternity is. And it's almost like saying, I use an analogy of health. Let's say someday they come up with a cure for cancer. I mean, a real cure. It cures it. All cancers, some sort of magic bullet pill. You take these following pills. Nevertheless, the pills come with horrific side effects. Mm-hmm. I mean, wicked, awful, horrible side effects that maybe go on for like a year. You might be paralyzed for a while or whatever. And yet, how foolish, therefore, would it be for someone who chain smokes 80 cigarettes a day to say, well, I'm going to keep smoking because they have a cure for cancer now.
Right.
It's like, well, no. There's still a huge price to be paid. And, I think it's even Origen who said, look, your sins are going to have to be purged. And that is going to be, you have no idea what a horrifically painful process that is going to be. It's, and purgation is going to be exquisitely awful, and more awful depending on the sins that you have committed and your commitment to those committed acts. Therefore, why? So the motivation, therefore, for being morally good is the same reason as to maintain your health. Who wants to have to take that cancer pill? Who wants to have to go through all that purgation and misery and pain and so forth? Why not grease the wheels? Why not allow yourself to enter immediately into the presence of God without all of that purgation?
Exactly, and from that perspective, and this is something that I think is really worth. Actually, I was in talks with a publisher recently to do a book on this from Maximus's perspective. But we need to remember that Origen's original doctrine of epikatasis, why it was so tenaciously held to even after a checkered legacy, why you will still find in monasteries people reading this stuff and asking, well, hold on a second, and asking questions, even to Maximus in the 7th century, so 500 years after Origen died, and why I think even today it still percolates and it arises and it comes back around, is because it actually makes an amazing amount of sense. I'm not saying it's the only one that can do this, but I am saying, again, to that point about it's not just an eschatological, like, what's your view? This is debate club. You take a side, I'll take a side. Let's fight about it. It actually makes sense out of our life now.
Yes.
That's why Origen's view was so powerful. And look, I'll prescind right now from the question of, like you said before, scholars debating Origin and so forth, and some of our beloved theologians, Henri de Lubac, all the, they were a part of this, and I think helpfully. But even let's just back up and say the typical Origenist story that you say is or isn't condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. It makes sense, regardless of whether or not I think it's true, it makes very clear sense of this life. I mean, we got to remember, as an Origin scholar that I worked with before, Peter Martins has pointed out, and others have as well, like, say, pre-existence of soul. That actually is a apologetically useful response to certain Gnostics who I think pretty with some common sense look around at this life and say, look, this is all from one creator. Why is there such incredible inequality from the very moment of birth?
Right.
Why is there such variety and such seeming injustice built into the fabric of being itself and human existence? Well, if you take a view like pre-existence of souls, which is I don't hold, but you could
or even reincarnation.
Or even reincarnation, anything, transmigration. You can say, look, it isn't what you see isn't a strict and transparent reflection of God's justice, because it's already a reaction to something that happened prior, the fall of souls from God's union. And here we are in this life, and God is catching the souls in order. So actually, His goodness is defended. His grace and kindness and His justice are all defended, because what you see is not what you get only in terms of a final picture. There was something that happened prior. There's something that's happening now, and this is your spiritual life, your prayer, your ascetic struggle, your repentance, your transformation by the Spirit, and through participation in the sacraments. And that makes sense of what you're doing now, because you're returning to that original state. Now, I think that's obviously, especially the first part, pre-existence became problematic later. But I'm just saying the point we need to recall is apokatasis is the ending of that story. The universal restoration of all things, taken from Acts 3:21, it's not just an eschatological opinion, sort of speculation that something just kind of occurred to me, like you're solving a grand word problem in like chemistry. Yeah. It's why do we begin the way we do here? Why do we do what we do in the middle while we're here? And where are we going afterwards? It's an entire picture of that. And I think that helps get at the deeper point that you're making, which is that, salvation ought to be something that illumines everything that we do here and now. It isn't just a verdict or a status. It really is fundamentally a transformation. It's you might say it this way. Salvation is God's finishing the work of creation itself.
Yes.
Including you and what you are to be. And I think that gets at a much richer understanding of things like divine judgment, which has already begun, right?
Yeah.
I was just looking at the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Catechism earlier today, and they explicitly make this point about judgment, and they cite John 1. It's already begun. Here, the incarnation is the beginning of divine judgment. And so anyway, I'm just saying that all these things are brought together in an integrative way.
They really are. And to go back to this notion that I like what you said about it, there's an existential dimension to this, not just some sort of conceptual eschatology that we're debating. There's an existential dimension to it. I remember when I had my interview with Bishop Robert Barron, we were discussing this very topic because he's Balthasarian and he's gotten in a lot of hot water for his, his statement that we can have a reasonable expectation that all are going to be saved. But we started talking about the fact, this existential dimension, that sin is its own punishment, even in this life.
Right.
And that one of the motivations for being morally good isn't that I'm just towing some moral line in order to be able to stand before some sort of judge in the future, and my tote book is going to have more good than bad on it. It's that it enhances our life in the here and now. Mm-hmm. It begins to redress some of those imbalances and inequalities in existence that we all feel, and it removes the thorn of our sins and their consequences. Why does an alcoholic attempt to quit drinking?
Right.
And why does a consummate liar seek to stop lying? Because those things have harmed them in the here and now. Also, I like to point this out a lot. There are entire world religions that are quite successful, thank you very much, that do not have a concept of an eternal hell. And so if the concept of an eternal hell as a punishment for our worldly sins, our finite worldly sins, is so necessary to motivate people to be morally good, then why is it that we find practitioners of, say, Buddhism that has no concept, unless I'm wrong, of an eternal hell? Why do they flourish nonetheless? It's because people see in its sort of contemplative method, its meditational method, the Buddha's eightfold path and all that, they see in that a pathway to happiness, in this life, to bliss even in this life, if not even in the next. So anyway, I throw that there.
No, that's a few things come to mind. One is I think it is remarkable how often we are, say, great proponents and champions of the liberal arts. And when we say something like about the true and the good and the beautiful, and we say, why does Mozart compose his symphonies? Why Bach is cello suites 1 through 6, the best piece of music ever, right, in my opinion. Well, we rightly point out all of a sudden we're talking about the transcendentals, and we say things like, look, you can't reduce everything to sort of utility. And actually, some of the things most important in life precisely resist that kind of explanation. Why should I love my kids? Is it simply just to get our species to the next generation?
Right.
Well, no, there's so much more there to love. There's so much more. You don't ask why did Mozart compose it. It is its own justification because it's beauty, right? And that is intrinsically where. But all of a sudden, when we go to soteriology, we go to salvation, to the unifying with the one and the good and the beautiful God Himself, infinite love. All of a sudden, it's like, well, hold on, we're utilitarian. It's like, well, you can't just rely on God to be self-sufficient and self-appealing to our own desires. And it's like, well, what happened to that transcendental?
I'm only going to do X, Y, Z because there's a utility to it at the end of the day, where I'm going to get, I'm going to live in Paradise Park in the sky, and
right, and then another point to make is kind of the inverse of what you were rightly making about the religion. It's like, look. If hell is so essential and effective, what happened to Western Europe? What happened to the actual, we're all talking about post-Christian this and that, and there's something true about that, but clearly it didn't work. Maybe it did for a while, but.
Yeah, I guess along with that, the height of sort of the corruption of the Catholic Church, say in the pornocracy of the 11th century or 9th century, or the Renaissance, happened to coincide to the height of the Massa Damnata doctrine, and everybody's got to be a Catholic or else they're going to be part of that Massa Damnata. That doesn't seem to have stopped popes from having children and.
Right, for any of that, right? And so it's just to say, right, let's be honest, it's more complicated, right? People's life decisions and what they do and why and to what degree they're going to commit a sin and be culpable. It's not reducible to their eschatological view. It's much more complicated, and so I don't know. I don't really find that a compelling.
Especially now, to get a little theological, when you combine that with Aquinas's belief, and I think he's right, his teaching, that nobody chooses evil for the sake of evil. We always choose, even in our immoral actions, we're doing so because we're choosing something under the auspices of the good. Adultery is wrong, but I'm not committing it just to, with my last breath, I spit at thee, to God. You're doing it because you want sexual pleasure with this person that you've sort of been smitten with. And sexual pleasure in and of itself is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's not an evil. And so you're choosing that. What makes it evil is that you're sacrificing a higher good for a lesser good. So your hierarchy of goods is all screwed up. But nobody is sitting there. And I know very few people in my life or in my own life, who when they sin say to them, "Oh, I better not do this because I'm going to go to hell if I do this."
Right.
Maybe some people do, but at the end of the day, it's not much. It's not much of a roadblock, it would seem, and I think world history sort of proves that out.
And so that point is crucial because I think it's another way to open up the kind of I think depth of the universalist perspective. Sometimes it gets painted out as this sort of hopeless or hapless optimism, right? Like, oh wow, you guys are just well intentioned. You got kind hearts. You want everyone to be saved. That's a nice sentiment. It's just not reality. But what I find is that if you really follow through this perspective, it paints in some ways more dire picture of the fallen creation. And the reason why is because we're so, I mean, look, you got not just Origen and Gregor of Nyssa, but you got Maximus. I agree with you. I think Augustine thinks this. I don't take a certain reading of the Paracene and the Confessions. I think Aquinas clearly has this, but say I'll just go to Maximus, my guy, and say he says blatantly multiple times, ignorance, delusion, deception is the mother of vice or evil.
Right.
And it's an old idea, and it's not exclusively a Christian idea, but it's exactly the point you're making that we don't. So someone once told me, like, look, so it's obviously wrong to say that we are unfree when we do bad things, because we often know things are wrong or bad or evil or sins, and we just do it anyway. And that's often what people are worried about. They're worried about, it's another way of saying, I'm worried about moral laxity or something. It's to say, if you tell everyone they're going to be saved in the end, then, it sounds as if you're saying that this delusion needs to be brought unveiled, and that's going to precipitate their union with God. It sounds as if you're saying nobody ever willingly or knowingly sins. No, not at all. What you're saying is nobody is fully free of ignorance.
Right.
And if they were, they would be like Jesus Christ, who could not sin, precisely because he had full and perfect knowledge of the Father through the Spirit, right? And that's Maximus denying, right, the gnomic will of the mode of deliberative, unsure, uncertain decision-making of Christ. He denies it of Christ, precisely because he's most free, not just divinely, but humanly. And that's right. And after when we get to heaven, the blessed don't sin; they can't fall again, precisely because they're most free. And Anselm makes this point too, that God is most free precisely because he can't will evil.
That's a great point. That is a perfect point.
Yeah, and he on his work, Anselm's on free will, he explicitly says we can't define freedom in such a way that it excludes God's. Because if you do, then you're excluding the thing that's the reality, who's supposed to be most perfectly free. All to say, I'm going to wrap it back around to this dire picture. If that's all true, then what it means is the fallen condition is exactly what kind of the New Testament depicts it to be very often. You are in bondage. Yes. You are enslaved. Now, as being enslaved, yes, you can more or less, you can do things that have degrees of culpability. Nobody's denying that. But it's this. When I sin, it's kind of back to what you said. When I sin, I do know enough to know it's wrong most of the time. I mean, there's other sins of omission and so on. But if I sit there and I deliberate and I commit a sin that I need to confess, surely I know it's wrong and I do deserve culpability. I need to do penance, whatever. But the more dire insight into that sin, that knowing, willful, voluntary sin, isn't that, oh wow, you're just you're a bad kid, you just broke the rule again, and you should know better. Actually, the dire point is that I don't believe in God as much as I thought I did.
There you go.
Key. I am fundamentally. So this is the dire part. I'm so disordered, right, in my soul. I am so ignorant, even of the things I explicitly say that I believe. If I truly believed in God, I would not even it wouldn't even have been an issue. I wouldn't deliberate about it at all, wouldn't hesitate. I would always cling to the Lord.
And that's a much more positive way of putting this than the negatively, I'm doing this to avoid being sent to hell. I go back to St. Paul. You talked about bondage,
yes.
that the New Testament image of sin in this life, as C.S. Lewis says, we live in enemy-occupied territory. All right, we live in this realm of principalities and powers. That's what Paul called it, and bondage. Paul, I think very astutely psychologically,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very clear that what Paul wants to say is it's the reality of death. It's the reality of death that hangs over human existence like this dark pall.
Mm-hmm.
And that reality of death weighs on us and weighs on us. And so we begin to try to cling to pleasures in this life that we know might be disordered and not quite right and so on. Because at the end of the day, we really do believe that death is the final word. And so,
Yes.
there's nothing after. And that we are in this bondage, and therefore we should, in a sense, try to eke out some sort of pleasure in this life. And that's why Paul says the resurrection and faith in the resurrection is what liberates us from this bondage. All right, because it liberates us from that fear of death, that fear So I would say this, that the number one motivation for sin isn't that people don't believe in hell; it's that they don't believe in the resurrection. They
Absolutely.
don't believe that death is
Yes.
just a transition to another. They really do believe death is the final word.
Absolutely, that's very well put. It reminds me especially of, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, Romans 5. I mean, that's Paul's logic there too. Romans 5. It's if grace abounds, should I sin? All the
Right.
more. It's a nonsensical question if you have been enslaved and liberated.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
you don't want to go back. There's nothing about the transition from being enslaved to liberated that's just so thrilling. You want to keep experiencing it. No, it's if you've really tasted freedom, it won't even
Right.
become an issue about. But here's the thing: we got to remember: it was Christ who liberated. He harrows hell. He descends. He breaks. Maximus says at one point, he breaks the darkness of hell's gloom, and he actually says he calls them eternal bonds. He's commenting on, I think, Jude 6 or something. But he says the eternal bonds, and they're called eternal, but just because they're eternal doesn't mean they can't be broken. And he thinks Christ's descent into hell breaks even eternal bonds, whatever that means, right? So he's playing with that. But nevertheless, that's the logic of salvation, is that I have been freed as Israel was brought up out of Egypt.
Yes.
Why would you want to turn back? And to your point, right? And to Paul's point, the reason why they wanted to turn back, even in the narrative of Exodus, is because they did not believe God was leading them to the promised land, but he was leading them to die in the desert.
Yes. Yes.
And so better to go back and eat my daily fill as a slave than to die out here.
I'd rather.
In the words, the resurrection, right? You don't believe in the promised land.
In the words of Billy Joel, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints, because I don't really believe the saints are going to get a payoff for all their crying.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is such a crucial point. It comes back to as well. Evagrius, just to name another sort of controversial, but Maximus takes this up as well. Evagrius says that apatheia, passionlessness or detachment, however you want to, is the mother of agape, right? Of love.
Yeah.
But the connection there is exactly what you said. It's not that Evagrius is saying you shouldn't feel emotions, or you should just be like completely and totally closed off and buffered to every relation and every good thing in this life. What he is saying is exactly what you said, and what Augustine says in the Confessions in his own way. Don't misjudge this as if it is final. Finitude is not final. Finitude is a necessary condition for creation, but the resurrection, the incarnation itself, the resurrection in our deification in the language of the East, not exclusively, but in that sort of way of looking at salvation, it is precisely, as Maximus says, the overcoming of the natural boundary between created and uncreated. And so there's two things that make up our fundamental delusion from Maximus's perspective. First, as you said, we mistake the finite for being final.
Right.
Second, we believe that simply chasing the finite goods of this life will render us infinitely satisfied. It's a two-step delusion. It's completely self-deceived, because not only do you think there's nothing beyond the grave, you believe that things that are on this side of the grave can give you that ultimate fulfillment that your spirit is always necessarily oriented towards and striving for. And that's that dire picture. And so
Yeah.
what we need is exactly what Paul says. Who will save me? Who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God, our Lord Jesus Christ. That he is the Savior in that sense. He's the liberator, right, from all delusion, all ignorance, and the one who woos our soul into the truth. And the truth sets
Yeah.
free, right? So,
Yeah. One question I often get from people who email me is, who are sympathetic to universalism, and David Hart's argument in his book is, this is such a short, 70 years, 80 for those who are strong. It's a short span of time that we exist in this material world, in the realm of time, vis-a-vis eternity. People say, then what was the point of this little finite period of time in which we live? Why not just make more angels? Why these incarnated souls that live on this planet for 70 years in such asymmetrical ways and all kinds of unfair inequalities, so on, only then to pass into the next life and have everything fixed there? What would you say to that question?
well, I mean, I would say a few things. One is, so Irenaeus contemplated this question, and not so much as a universalist, but he's directly raises the question, and against heresies, some will ask, why were we not just made gods,
Right.
or as you said, right, made angels? Why aren't we just angels? And one of the things he says that I've always found useful, and that's taken up by later thinkers, is just the fact that you're created. There is a necessity involved in being a creature, which does mean you have a beginning. Like you've emerged at some point.
Right.
You're not simply essentially co-eternal with God. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any becoming or creation. It would just be you.
Right.
So there is a metaphysical response. He has two responses. The first one I sort of say is a metaphysical response, which is just a common sense thing. Look, finitude, having a beginning, being created means having a beginning. Having a beginning means being finite in your origins, like in the first dawn of your existence. You can't avoid that. Even when God became incarnate, right, he began in time. So there's now he's both. But just to say, right, but there's a second response that he makes that I think is a little. It's actually really just as compelling or more relevant to our conversation. He also says that God is not begrudging, which is to say, his picture, as he explicitly says, Irenaeus says, right, of Adam and Eve, is that creation is a project of raising children. So, yes, you have a beginning, but you also need to live into the maturation, right, the full stature of Christ, to use Paul's language. You have to be led along individually and as an entire humanity,
Yes.
and ultimately as a creation, right? And so that means, he says, God is long suffering, God is patient, God is not begrudging. He will not even, right, force his goodness. Now, somebody might, the astute person, be like, see, look, that's why universalism is bad, right? Is that God will never force it on you. Well, let's table that for a second. I think it's worth thinking about. But just that this initial point that it's not that you have just 60, 70, 80 years here and it's over and that just seems worthless. It's that you're created, and so you couldn't have began in any other way than as a finite life, a beginning.
Right. Right.
And so there's that point. Maximus complicates it because he agrees with that. And so he agrees with Irenaeus that we have to, in Irenaeus' words, become accustomed to divinity over time. You have to get used to God. It's such a high calling. You can't just jump into it. This goes back to the idea of salvation as a real transformation, not just a status.
Right.
So it takes time. It takes time, right? Maximus complicates it. He comes in and he says, well, but it's also very difficult to see how we would understand. So the initial innocence of ignorance, innocent ignorance that we begin with, childlike ignorance, it's also difficult to see how we will apprehend rightly judge the world, ourselves, and God ultimately, if we are not yet divine and do not yet know creation as God does. So this is a dilemma. On the one hand, you have to begin in order to be a creature at all. And so you have to get used to divinity, your high calling to become God, to become divine or however. But then the other side is, it's very hard to see how you will do that rightly, since you also begin in necessary ignorance.
Yes.
So this is a dilemma, and there's interesting ways
Yes,
to work
no,
with it.
I think everything you say is it's usually the kind of things that I say to people when they ask me that question. There's also the reality, the fact, that let's say humanity had never sinned, and then we're going to get back to universalism. Let's say humanity had never sinned. Perhaps we would have simply been granted a natural immortality, and this life would not have been short. It would have been very, very long. But because we sinned, and goes back, to the ancient prayer and the exalted, O Felix culpa, a happy fault that gained for us so great a redeemer. God then brings out of the fallenness of our condition, which then includes death, a certain finality to this material existence, a greater transformation in the incarnate. It goes back to what we said in the last interview about creation being grounded in the incarnation as such. But anyway, that's all great stuff. I'm getting a little buzz here in my. I hope the video, the audio is going to be okay.
Yeah.
But let's move on. Let's get back to universalism per se. After that little segue, there are two fundamental questions then for a Catholic, let's say, that have to be addressed. First, the scriptural statements, and I know David Hart deals with it, the scriptural statements, especially the statements from Christ. Christ spoke a lot about hell. And he talked about, the narrow path that few take, the wide path that almost everybody takes, and that there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth, and you're going to be tossed into the outer darkness, and where, the Satan in the book of Revelation and the demons are going to be cast into the lake of fire forever and ever and ever, and all these kinds of things. David Hart pointed out to me that, and he makes this point in the book, that the way around this is that we have mistranslated these Greek terms in the New Testament that talk about the eternity of hell. And I have my own sort of interpretation of some of these verses too, but let's begin with you. What do you make of these statements from Christ?
Well, yeah. So a few different levels, I guess, we might approach this on. One, it would be a sort of more historical grammatical approach and say, like notice, for example, some of the language being used is fairly typical of Second Temple apocalyptic literature, say like First Enoch. So
Exactly.
You look there and you say, is this really a systematic presentation of here's exactly how things are going to go? Here's whatever this word has a univocal meaning. No, they don't.
As I like to say, I don't think Jesus was giving us an eschatological census.
Absolutely not. And even as the Catechism points out, right? I mean, the immediate point of all this is always an exhortation. It's always like, look, it's just something to say. These are images. And as David points out in the book too, I think rightly, look, there are a lot of images here. There isn't just one kind. There are a lot of images that you might more easily say that's annihilationism.
Yeah.
Look, the chaff is burned up.
Yeah.
The straw in the oven is burned up. There's nothing left.
Even the imagery of the outer darkness.
The outer darkness, right. All of that, right. And you got the stuff with, Jerusalem has this, maybe did or did not, scholars argue about this valley where they burned all this trash and the waste and so forth. And so it's an image, it's brought in, but there's other interpretations. So all to say, I think on the historical grammatical level, it's correct to say, look, we have a hodgepodge of images. They all generally communicate the big point that judgment will occur and you will suffer, no question. But you can't really say on that level, on the level of the textual imagery, that it's just you're getting a clear picture of here's the exact sequence of how things will unfold eschatologically. Because if you do that, then the question becomes, which image is going to be the regulative one?
Right.
Is it the annihilationist images? Is it the ones where you pay the last fireling, but you eventually do get out, like a universalist sort of picture, a purgative one?
Yeah.
Or is it this, let's just table the translation for now and just say, if there's eternal weeping and gnashing of teeth, like perpetual, if it meant that, which one are you going to use to regulate the other? So I do want to point that out and say, look, it isn't just the universalist here that has interpretive issues. And that's a thing I think that's a little bit unfairly put sometimes. It's like it's as if the universalist has to explain a bunch of text, whereas everyone else they don't. It's all pretty clear.
Let me stop you for a second, and I'm not saying I disagree with you. I agree with you actually, but to play devil's advocate, is not the point that a lot of traditionalists make is not the cumulative weight of the common sense interpretation of all these images, is that Christ is presenting to us the fact that some people are going to go to hell forever.
Okay, so forever, right? And I would say no, it isn't. I mean,
I agree.
it's if you want to just stay on the level of the logic of the images or the stories or the narratives, it is a mixed bag. It isn't just a cumulative weight. I mean, most of the time people don't realize, as it's often pointed out, eternal hell is not in the Pauline epistles.
Nowhere.
Nowhere. And then let's go to say the apocalypse. Let's go to Revelation. And I'm going to make a few points that Origin already pointed out. Which is a side note, right? I think it's funny that people like Origin is one of the most, as you mentioned earlier, the most outspoken and earliest proponents of universalism. He's also one of the greatest exegetes of the patristic era, commenting the entire Bible, creating a text critical apparatus. He knew the text. It's not like he wasn't aware of what the text
Right.
is. So, he makes a few different. Let's go to say two passages that are very, commonly evoked for look, it's obviously eternal, perpetual torment. One would be like a Revelation 20. The devil and his angels and the wicked are thrown into the lake of fire, and the smoke of their torment burns and rises forever and ever. Right? Okay, that sounds pretty much like the picture, right? That's it. That's hell. You're thrown in. Now, there's a few things there, though, that are odd. One is that death is also thrown in there. So the death of death is a part of the image. A second thing to point out, which is what Origen pointed out, is that one of the key groups of people in the apocalypse that are always the enemy of God and that oppose God are the kings of the earth. Right? And this harkens back to the Psalms, why did the nations rage and so forth. So the kings of the earth, who are like the unholy Trinity's army, right? The dragon, the two beasts, and the kings of the earth go to war even in Revelation 19, the chapter prior, against the church, surround the city, right? Of course, there's always, as many exegetes point out, there's never actually any war in the book of Revelation. They always gather for war, and then nothing. They just are destroyed. So that happens. You get to 20. You get the picture of the lake of fire. But look, you get to 21, and there's this interesting and odd fact here about the New Jerusalem. It says that the kings of the earth bring their glory into the city. And you might say, oh, so what is this, like a Roman triumphal entry thing? My brother's done a lot of work on Roman triumphal entry in these chapters. Not simply that, because it says just a little bit later, it says, nothing impure or wicked enters the city. And Origen pointed out already long ago, hold on a second. This category of people, the kings of the earth, who have constantly warred against the church, against the Mother of God, against the Trinity, against the Lamb, and have been defeated now about 4 times in the book. They show up in the New Jerusalem, and they enter it, and nothing impure can enter it. So it's as if they reappear after they've been thrown into the lake of fire, and they are made new. They're pure, and they're there.
Yes.
And they're giving glory to God. Right, so I'm just saying again, it's another point to say, look, exegetically, there for a long time there's been observations like that can be made, or like let's say Matthew 25. We've got the sheep and the goats. You've got the symmetry that even Saint Basil pointed out. He sort of resisted the universalist interpretation, at least in one text. And Origen points out, what's interesting though is that there's never a mention of any resurrection in Matthew 25. It's not like you get the clear picture, say, as you do in Daniel, where there's the resurrection, some to glory, some to damnation, and then you get the last judgment. You just get this judgment scene, which is a part of the parable and exhortation, to actually care for the least of these. That's the real point. And so all I'm saying is and so Origen points out, we don't really know when this is in the eschatological map sequence, because there's no general resurrection, so we don't know. And some people point out, but there is in Daniel, and it's like, but that's actually all the more interesting that it's not included in Matthew 25 if it is resonating.
That's right.
Anyway, we could go through, but all of that to say, I think they're exegetically on the level of the text, the historical grammatical context, looking at the words, the translation, and the images themselves. No, I don't think it's obvious, and I think Origen wasn't wrong or sort of duped to see as he's reading through the Greek and Hebrew. It isn't at all obvious that this one way is the right way.
Yeah, and I think it's instructive that the notion, the sort of later doctrinal things about hell in the Catholic Church that then crystallize around a very literal reading of these things only emerges after a period of tremendous ignorance of the church fathers that had sort of set in, especially in the church in the West, and their exegetical prowess, so to speak. But I don't want to make too big of. I want to come back to your point about apocalyptic and the genre, because I think it's terribly important. I've written before that my approach, to add on to what you just said, is that what we're dealing with here in Christ, you mentioned, he's bringing back, Book of Enoch, these kinds of things. It's also evoking the language of the two ways that one finds, like in the Book of Deuteronomy. Today I present to you the way of life and the way of death. Now choose. This was very central to Judaism, especially in Second Temple Judaism. There are children of the light, there are children of darkness. There's the path of life, there's the path of death. This is crisis language. All right. This is decisional language, what Balthasar calls the Ernstfall, the moment of decisive choosing. And what Christ, we have to remember, Christ is saying the kingdom is upon you. It's here. You must choose now. You must choose. And your choice is going to result in this, or it's going to result in that. And he's he's deliberately, therefore, placing it within this crisis language, two ways category that I don't necessarily then can be reduced down to an eschatological census of where Jesus is saying to us, yep, there's going to be tons of people in hell, only a few people in heaven, because there are too many countervailing statements in the New Testament that would make such an interpretation, feasible. I think that's a very, very important point that has to be made in all of this, that it's not just to be taken so literally. Well, what about David Hart's translation of the Greek word aionios that we just routinely take to mean eternal, as in endless duration, and yet Hart says it doesn't always mean that in various contexts, and he shows very, I think, astutely in his book that it doesn't always. Sometimes it just means until the end of a certain age.
Right, yeah, and look, that's one thing I wanted to say about Hart's position that I do think gets mischaracterized sometimes is he, as I understand him, and he can email me if he wants and misrepresent him, but he isn't saying, and you didn't say this either, I just want to make this clear because I've seen people accuse him of basically saying it's not like Hart is meeting one univocal meaning of aionios with a different one.
Right, exactly. He admits that it's polyvalent.
He does, and I think even in his footnote on the Matthew 25 and his translation of the New Testament, he makes a similar admission, and even about the two different words for punishment and how, yes, before there was a clear demarcation, but by this time it's all contextual. You're not sure if it means like retributive or restorative, right? So, but he makes similar admissions about, I think, the word. But that's all you really need to say, I think. I'm less, not so much than David, but other people seem to be very taken. And I think there's useful work to be done. There's whole books that have been written on the etymological arguments you may or may not make about whether or not this, which sense of the word predominates in what context. That's all interesting. It's important. I don't want to simply dismiss it. However, I've come to think that no debates will be settled on those grounds for two reasons. One is, as David points out, you just don't get a univocal meaning like that. I mean, you can go the translation of the Septuagint. Right. You're going to find ion, right, the noun form. That will at one point in the Septuagint refers to simply a single life, like of a slave, an ion. And so the age there, as you said, it's just a span of time.
Exactly.
You can go to more high flight. You can look at the Timaeus in Plato's Timaeus, and there's two different kinds of eternity. Certainly in Plotinus, there's two different kinds of eternity, and yet they're using these words, right? You could go all the way to Maximus the Confessor, as I mentioned earlier. He uses eternal bonds, and he even uses the stronger sense of eternity, aidios. He uses that for eternal bonds, and yet they're broken. They're broken. So
I was going to come back to that because that was a very interesting statement you made earlier about Maximus saying the eternal bonds are broken.
Right, and so what's more important, I think you're right to say, both in terms of the apocalyptic literature and therefore the context within which these words are used, whether it's apocalyptic or like in philosophical context, it really is going to be the context in the sense of the imagery, the logic of the narrative or the imagery itself, that's going to be the immediate sense, the immediate interpretation. But again, taking this as if it's a univocal and therefore transparent picture of eschatological of the sequence or how things are going to go. It's just not. So I think that's one reason, is that it's just too messy. It just doesn't work that way. But the other one is that, let's say that there is something close to a univocal meaning of a word like aionios. Really, the word itself is fundamentally a negation. The is alpha privative, as I understand it, which is to say,
It is. The alpha is an alpha privative.
I think so. I mean, I think it's open to debate, but I'm just saying you could make
Okay.
the argument, because I think you can make an argument. There's sort of a combination with on, the participle
Right.
being.
Right.
Ionios is sort of like what is not, but not in the sense that it doesn't exist at all, like out of nothing, but in the sense of what's to come. It's not yet. It is not now. So
Right.
Ionios is sort of, insofar as it means an age to come, it simply means not this age. Right?
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
are there contexts where it seems to clearly mean perpetual? Sure, of course there are. And I don't think anyone's denying that. It's just that you can't settle the debate, the conceptual, eschatological, properly theological debate on anything etymological. And I think that's what David's basically been saying. So he's troubling the waters, right? And saying, look, if you just assume it's plain, then you're wrong. And you need to understand what's
he certainly
happening with
troubles the
Greeks.
waters. That's why I thought though your comment about Maximus and the breaking of eternal bonds was so significant, because ultimately, okay, the New Testament, as I said, Jesus presents us with this two ways crisis apocalyptic language. Choose this, not that. Here are the consequences. But the countervailing verses and narratives in the New Testament to all of that is, of course, that Christ, in his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension, in a sense, overcomes all of those polarities. He overcomes the two ways. He overcomes this bifurcation and sums up everything with him so that he can present to the Father and everything will be all in all.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is exactly, and I think David takes this cue pretty strongly from Gregory of Nyssa on this point in his text in Illud. It's on 1 Corinthians 15 in the all in all passage, like 1 Corinthians 28. And in the subjection, particularly of the Son to the Father, in the end, when he presents it all, it says the Son, and Gregory asked the question, well, hold on, and in the Arian or the eunomius controversies, it's sort of like, well, hold on, anything that suggests subordination of the Son to the Father is a problem. And it seems like that on the face of the text, that the Son gives over the kingdom to the Father in the end. And what's remarkable is Gregory turns in response to that interpretation that would make the Father and Son not consubstantial, because the Son is subordinate, will be subjected to the Father in the end. He makes a pretty remarkable and I think compelling case that what's really being referred to there is the Son's subjection in all of us.
Yes.
And in us, insofar as we're members of the body of Christ, we are offered up to the Father.
Yes.
And so the Son's identification with us is actually the grounds for his defense of the Son's divinity with the Father.
It's part of his whole kenotic descent into our time and place. Now that verse, go ahead, David.
I was going to say, and David takes that, I think he calls it something like the dual horizon, or the double horizon, the eschatological horizon, where you do have that initial process of subjection. There you're going to get the fire, you're going to get the purgation, you got the judgment, you got the sheep and the goats, but then there's a further horizon, which would be when God is all in all.
And that's what that means then, prior to the all in all part of that verse, where it says that after Christ has subdued his enemies and placed them under his feet, then he can place all of this to the Father. But what does it mean that they are under his feet? Does it mean that he's punishing them, destroying them? Or does it mean that all that is resistant to the Father has now been vanquished, has now been overcome?
And this opens to a really important point that we've been hovering around. Origen asked exactly the question you just did there. What does it mean that the Son is subject? And you kind of have two options here, other than, Gregory takes Origen's proposal. But one option would be to say, we know what subjection means. You can think of it as a vassal or a king or some dominant power or tyrant subjecting subjects. That's obviously not what the Son is subjected to. Or you can think about it in reverse. Since the Son is subjected to the Father, it must be utmost good. It must be total salvation. And so, therefore, we too must become subject to the Father. And this is where we open to something I think is super profound and really very little explored, except by our friend Balthasar, especially in Theodrama 5, where you get the sense, like, hold on a second, like you said earlier, the apocalyptic two ways. that I think is right. And on the initials, that's the exhortative, the hortatory, all that,
Yeah.
beckoning
So
people to live.
admonitory. Yeah.
Right. Now you can also come to a deeper understanding of what that means, and it's not contradictory. It's just a further sense.
It's a deepening of that very scenario.
And that scenario is, look, the two ways are already in you. You yourself are already double-minded. Again, back to delusion and ignorance. You are always oscillating between the two paths. And so you have to, as Paul says, you have to come to put off your old self. You have to be crucified with Christ. In other words, you got to be judged and killed. But that is because the very pattern of salvation is resurrection from death. And so you're putting to death your own, right, the law that's at work within your bodies. It's not as if you're not dying and being judged and even being perpetually, like Balthasar calls this, the unusable residue. That's what he says.
Yeah.
It's not as if, so there's a sense in which I think you can make this argument, and some have hinted at it, that hell, ultimately, the destination is for those illicit and deluded parts of us that we have falsely identified with ourselves. And that needs to be separated. Crisis, judgment, division. You do need to be divided straight down because you have created division within yourself, which is totally based on
Very
ignorance.
interesting. That's right. I'd actually forgotten that part of Balthasar's Theodrama 5. That's excellent.
Yeah.
That's really fantastic. And it reminds me, too, St. Augustine, in writing The City of God, it's interesting. He lives in the Constantinian era, so to speak, the post-Constantinian era. And yet, Augustine, here's the Roman Empire falling all around, and the Christians are going, "Oh, it's the end of the world," and the Romans are saying it's all your fault. And Augustine never gives us an elaborate, extensive theory of the relationship between church and state. Instead, he gives us a performative accounting of history, and he says, "Look, it's all about the amor Dei versus the libido dominandi. Unless you think the amor Dei is simply all of us in the church, and the libido dominandi is everybody out there, this is something that cuts through the heart of every single one of us."
So this is, yes, and I love that part, and I love his this right, and exactly, here's another thing from Augustine I learned in the later parts of the City of God. Obviously, I would differ with him on certain conclusions he makes there, but
yes,
that's fine. But he says something that I think is profoundly important. It's a common way, but in his brilliant rhetoric, he always has a way of summing these things up in a memorable manner. And he says, right, that there is no efficient cause of evil; it's only deficient. But he then meditates on how that means that, again, ignorance, that evil, the origins of evil are necessarily absurd.
Interesting. That's right.
And so he has this moment where he says, like, this is, he sees this like phenomenologically, evidence of this in the fact that you can't even imagine your own death. Death is so, in some sense, unnatural, against what we were created for, our end, that you can't imagine your death, because, of course, if you're imagining your death, it's not you dying, because who's looking at it? And then, right, and then if you really die, you're not looking at anything, certainly not your own death.
Oh, I remember reading that in Augustine so well. It struck me so, boom, right in the face.
And so here's where I'd throw this out. I just want to throw this out as a possibility then. If the origins of evil are necessarily absurd, to plain sense, it doesn't mean it's not real, obviously. It just that you can't abstract theorize, aridly theorize about this, because it's necessarily absurd. Why wouldn't the defeat of evil bear similar absurd appearance? Like, I have been crucified with Christ, and somehow yet I live. So somehow there's two eyes, the eye who has been put off and killed, and the one, well, that's just simply reflecting the absurdity of evil built into the very foundations of sin itself.
Well, that's very profound. This is why I like interviewing young scholars like yourself, because when you get to be almost 64, I'm 63, I'll be 64 in October, as I am. You've forgotten more theology than you remember. And one of the things I like about talking to young scholars such as yourself, who are really at the top of their game, is there's an anamnesis that happens within me. It's like, yeah, now I remember reading that in Augustine. That is fantastic. I remember reading that. I haven't actually done a reread of The City of God in maybe 20 years. And so maybe, you're spurring me on. Maybe I need to go reread that again. But let's move on. But we're sort of running out of time. This has been already a little over an hour. But now we have to address an elephant in the living room for Catholics.
Yeah.
and that is the dogmatic tradition
Yeah.
around these issues. Now, I'm, for the first time in the history of doing these videos or in my blog writing, I'm coming out of the closet and I'm going to tell my viewers I am a universalist. Okay. People have suspected that I am. Are you just a Balthazarian, a Darewey? I respect Balthazar. I love Darewey Hope. But I simply, in my old age and my dotage, have reached the conclusion that universalism is true, a certain version of it.
Yeah.
But what has caused me to hold back from saying that isn't cowardice, isn't clickbait. Oh, I'll lose half my subscribers. No, it's that I am a Catholic, and I know with regard to David Hart, if you would say to him, well, what you've just said is contrary to the dogmatic traditions, he would say, well, so much the worse then for the dogmatic traditions. And okay, I'm not going to criticize that. That's his view. It's not a view that I can sort of warm up to, though. I do believe in the authority of the magisterium of the Catholic Church to teach in matters of faith and morals in a way that is, certain for this, matters dealing with our salvation. And so I have to take seriously these dogmatic claims of the church. And there's a couple that bear on this question. The Catholic Church does teach that hell is eternal. It in not in some temporary sense, but in a forever sense. And it does teach that post-mortem conversion does not happen. It teaches that at the moment of death, you go to either heaven, hell, or purgatory. And the language often says immediately you go to heaven, hell, or purgatory based on, your status in this life. So I've had to now, as I'm an Orthodox Catholic, I'm not some wild-eyed dissident. So the church is wrong about that. I'm not that kind of a Catholic theologian. So I live now in this dilemma. I now live within this tension of how do I reconcile the fact that as a theologian, I embrace the arguments in favor of universalism. But then as a Catholic theologian, I step back and say, what does that mean further then for the magisterium of the church? What do we make of these doctrines? What would you say to that? Help me out here.
Oh, man. Well, so I kind of want to make it personal to start off. I have also gotten a lot of these inquiries as well, and it's a really serious issue that people this raises a serious existential question for people, and it weighs on them, especially those of our persuasion that are like, no, to me, it's not just that it's again, this isn't like a math problem that we figured out here, or it's an existential, it's a matter of faith in that deeper sense of trust, like a relationship with God, in fact. And so I totally get the burden. I wasn't raised Catholic, and so perhaps it's for some people a strike against, like, oh, of course you're thinking these things, but one of the reasons why I became Catholic was because I came to believe that the Catholic Church, I'm not saying anything about other churches, but the Catholic Church has the capacity and it has the courage to handle these questions without the kind of anxieties that I sensed in my prior tradition. And so there is a wager that I've personally put into this, which is that the truth is one, and we are on the way to perceiving it. Now I know, look, and this is the beginning of a response then, there are texts, like I'm thinking particularly of Dei Filius and from Vatican I, that seem to be very understandably worried about claims for deeper understandings of the dogma, which is a sort of pretense for we're actually going to reject the dogma and do something totally different.
Right. We'll so deepen it that we'll reject it.
Exactly. Now, and obviously that stuff has happened, and those have been problems, and it's still something to make a generic caution against. However, you read Fides et Ratio, you read the actual history of the church itself. That can't simply be the only thing we're worried about. Another thing to worry about is that you put a lid on the depths of the mysteries of the Christian faith, and you pretend as if we have got it all figured out. There's nothing more to see here. And so we definitely know, for example, that words like eternal can't be understood in any other way, or hell can't be understood in any other way, or the crucifixion of the old self can't be understood in any other way. We've got it. It's done. To me, that's just as presumptuous as saying, well, we can simply reject the dogma. In fact, I will say, people can believe it or not, but I came to a view of eschatological judgment as a sort of division, right, of a false self that I think you can get from not only Paul but also the monastic tradition, and it's talks about phantasms and bringing into existence what God doesn't will. I came to that by reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church on hell, sections 1035 through 1038. And one thing that's clear to me is that if you're going to be a Roman Catholic, you have to make a distinction between hell and purgatory. So my thought is, how do you do that and be a universalist, right? As just one example. Well, one way to do it is the Balthasarian unusable residue, the Paul's old self, the monastic sort of false self that needs to be destroyed. Really does need to be destroyed. St. Maximus says, like Nineveh was destroyed and saved at the same time. He says, and what you do is you say, look, that is a different understanding, and it's a deeper understanding, but it does not abrogate the distinction between hell and purgatory, because the unusable residue is precisely as Balthasar said, unusable. There's nowhere it can go or do. There's nothing you can bring out of it that's good. It's totally delusional. It needs to be perpetually destroyed. That, to me, is a clear picture of the destination of the occupants of hell. Now, there's going to be a question people are going to raise. Well, look, it says the souls descend into hell, and then we have to get into questions. Well, okay, what is the soul, and what exactly is the relationship between the soul and this false self, for example, that sin brings into being? Now, I just want to say this before you respond. People might say, okay, hold on, this is getting, you're just nitpicking, you're trying to find loopholes and so forth. I'm going to submit two things in response to that. And this is a part of the wager I have as being a Catholic. Number one is, in the actual history of dogma, this has already occurred. You can't claim to respect the tradition, for example, of Nicaea to Chalcedon, and neglect the fact that Nicaea anathematizes anyone who says that the Son differs from the Father by hypostasis.
That's right. And by Chalcedon, they're saying the opposite.
It's saying the opposite. And look, here's the thing, though, right? It seems to be the exact opposite. So what, did they just change? No. As St. Basil, he was forced to explain in a letter. Maximus quotes that letter, and he has to explain. You make the argument that it's a deepening. It's a deepening. Now, were the authors of the Council Fathers in Nicaea, did they have that in mind? Probably not. Who knows? We can't know. But the way the character of the tradition does go deeper and deeper into the mysteries, and we do, by the way, have the Spirit as a whole church to do that, according to 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. And so we can search even the depths of God, not because we're really smart or really good, but because the Spirit has deigned to reside in us through Christ. And so now that's a generic statement still. I'm still being abstract. Necessarily so, and this is the second point I want to make. Abstract condemnation of something called universalism, which isn't a word that's in the conciliar tradition, or abstract optimism about, let's just throw off the tradition and just do something different to catch up with the times. Right. Both of those are not ways, in my opinion, at least. Those are not truly ways to think with the church. The church doesn't issue abstract condemnations, and insofar as it does, if their view doesn't meet the abstract condemnation, it is not condemned. Otherwise, Nicaea and Chalcedon are irreconcilable.
Yeah, and even Nicaea, I have so many things I want to say about this. Even Nicaea, in its introduction of the term homoousios, to describe, consubstantial with the Father, if memory serves, homoousios was a term that had been condemned by a few local councils and synods as no, that's heretical. And yet here's Nicaea specifically adopting this term because it wants to deepen our understanding of the consubstantial nature of Christ with the Father. I would also point out along the lines of, this opens up the whole can of worms about how do doctrines develop?
Yeah.
Is it a Lorenian path or something else? David Hart has a new book out on tradition. There's Robert Wilkin has some interesting things to say. But you cannot help, if you understand no church history, for example, let's take the doctrine extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. If you go back and read Council of Florence and a few others, I mean, come on. Almost the entire church at one time sort of held the opinion, whether loosely or more securely, that most people are going to hell, and that pretty much the line of demarcation is visible entry into the Catholic Church or not. You have to be subject to the Roman pontiff to make it to heaven. And now along comes the 20th century and Vatican II, and we're saying, oh, woo, hold on, Poindexter. That was they were mainly talking about apostates and obstinate apostates. They weren't talking about all the I don't know. There's a lot of anti-Semitism tossed in there too. You Jews are all going to burn. And well, let's talk about the change in our attitude towards the Jews from
right.
Or, in Exsurge Domine, that the Pope condemned the thesis of Luther that you shouldn't burn people at the stake, heretics, because that's against the Holy Spirit. And the Pope says, the heck, it is not from the Holy Spirit. It's right from the Holy Spirit. I condemn that view. And anybody who doesn't condemn it with me is anathema. So my point, you can see where I'm going with this. Yeah. I mean, this narrative that we have bought into, mainly a sort of conservative Catholic narrative of this total material continuity in doctrine seamlessly over the centuries, that narrative is simply false. It is demonstrably false. Yes. And the problem that I find with so many traditionalists is that and why they reject Vatican II and the entire modern church is that they too kind of sense of, well, the church does seem to have changed its views on some things, so that's got to all be wrong. The change has to be wrong, not what came before. So this is a very vexing problem for people. So I would agree with you. I'm adding under what you said about we need to deepen. Truly, one of the doctrines that needs to deepen is precisely the doctrine of how doctrines develop. Yes. And we need to have a greater sense. So distortion, even Joseph Ratzinger says with regard to the council, he doesn't call it a hermeneutic of continuity. He calls it a hermeneutic of reform, because every council introduces certain micro ruptures with the past. The council, otherwise, the council is addressing problems. And in order to do those problems, certain distortions creep into doctrines that have to be corrected. Infallibility of the church is a negative charism. It's not a positive charism like inspiration of Scripture. It's negative. It simply means church isn't going to make some serious howler of a mistake on something central to our faith. But it doesn't guarantee that the understanding of the formulation of those dogmas is always going to be optimum.
Right.
And so my point would be with regard to the doctrine of hell, to go along with what you said about the deepening of the sense of which one of ourselves, in a sense, goes to hell and so on, is the distortion that began to creep in is a purely juridical forensic understanding of judgment. All right. The tote book, ledger book view of judgment. Okay. That good deeds here, bad deeds there. Let's weigh them in the scales. Did you repent of these bad ones? Oh, you didn't? Okay. Off to hell with you. It's just as simple as that. It's like standing in front of an earthly magistrate, and there you go. And I think that's precisely the distortion that any development of our doctrine of hell has to take into consideration. Finally, I would say this. The church says hell is eternal, but it doesn't teach us that anybody is actually there, maybe outside of the demons. I don't know. The church does not teach that we have to believe that anybody actually goes to hell. And thus Balthasar's dare we hope becomes a possibility. Secondarily, it says there can be no post-mortem conversion. And Balthasar sort of kind of agrees on that, but he sort of fudges on it in dare we hope a bit too. But I would say this, one of the things that always strikes me is that traditionalists who adhere to that very strictly, someone like a Ralph Martin, for example, would say, okay, it says when you die, you go immediately to these things. Well, they're dealing with a fairly modern conception of death that they have in mind. It's as a pure cessation of biological activity, whereas death is also a theological activity. Death is a process. And my point would be, you're not dead, as in the Princess Bride. You're not mostly dead, just dead. All right. You're not really dead until God says you're dead, until God, in a sense, ratifies your death. And so there might be stages to the death process. There's the biological death, and then there is a sort of final death after you meet God or whatever, so that there might be a sort of moment, an interstice in between biological death and God ratifying your death spiritually, in which a decision of clarity can be made. That's purely speculative on my part. But anyway, I toss that out there.
No, and that has to be. Look, God has died. God has experienced the separation of soul and body
Yes.
in His person, the person of the Son. Does that do nothing to our perception of what it means to die? I mean, are we simply
Right.
just looking around and deducing the best we can by pure reason? Well, it looks like the soul goes away from the body, and it looks difficult. I mean, again, this is highly speculative, even on the Thomistic Aristotelian account. Like disembodied souls can't change for the better, or right, there is no purgation. It's like, well, okay.
Right.
I mean, there are church fathers that wouldn't agree with that, but yeah, no. Back to the overall point there is, I think is crucial, is that I think I saw he recently passed, so God bless him. But John O'Malley's book, I know it's controversial, What Happened at Vatican II. One of the points he made there that I've always thought was interesting and important is that the so-called progressive strand, right, of the counts who's fighting Ottaviani and all those, like,
Right.
is they often did do a rhetorical disservice, even though it was short-sighted. It was a short-term strategy to pretend that what they were saying, for example, about religious liberty or whatever, was always kind of there, and it's always what we've more or less explicitly said with a few adjustments. So the rhetoric was one of total continuity, even though if you really look at it, and I know you've had guests on here talking about this.
Yeah.
So I think this is where my wager lies, is that I think we can do better. I think an abstract conservatism and an abstract progressivism are not really the person of Christ, whose body is the church. The person of Christ is too determinate for all that. And it's Christ's body through time and our continual apprehension of the truth, which does actually deepen. It doesn't always do that, and that's the whole thing. You have to get determinate at some point. We can only live in these abstract judgments and condemnations for so long. It gets us very little. And so I would just say here that I think that is going to be kind of the path ahead, is to say, look, I want to submit this proposal. I want to submit this way of making sense of being Catholic and being Universalist, and I'm not going to do it just by saying, well, it just makes God seem a lot nicer or something. What I'm going to do is I want to go back, and this is where the resourceful, and I have to say, some of the people that were worried about the resourceful, I think they had some legitimate worries given their perspective, which was, look, if you throw open the doors to the archive and you haven't explored yourself everything that's there, you're not quite sure what you're going to find. And yet it's a very awkward place to be, because rhetorically you've placed yourself as the guardian of the whole archive, but you don't even know what's there. And so when you go back and look, I'm going to look at the New Testament. I'm going to say, look, when Paul talks about an old self, is that just a metaphor? Or is there something more there? And now I'll make the argument there's more there. When the monastics talk about a false self and the delusions of the thoughts and so forth, and that you embody them, is that just a nice way of saying I sinned and broke a rule? Or is there something more there? I'm going to say there's something more there. And then we're going to keep going down the line. And this is a progressive deepening. And it doesn't mean that every move is a progressive. That's a judgment that's determinate. It's not an abstract yes or no ahead of time. And so this is the courage. This is the speculative courage which arises out of the Catholic faith that I have at least I put my bet on here. And I just want to say one final thing, and I want to hear your thoughts again. Like, I sometimes wonder, like, what does it mean? And I don't think we're in dissent even. But let's go to that.
No,
extreme.
I don't see myself as dissenting at all.
Well, let's go for a second to that extreme category. What does it mean in Donum Veritatis, like section 17? Right, written by then Cardinal Ratzinger, head of the CDF. What does he mean when he says sometimes someone in dissent can find themselves suffering for the truth, and if it's the truth, it will be manifest? I mean, is that even a possibility in principle for a lot of other people? Because it's the way people talk, it seems like that's not even a possibility in principle, but he seems to consider it's at least possible. Yeah. I don't think we're even there. I'm just saying that's the limit case, right? That would be, oh, you're in dissent, like you're just straight up rejecting. If even in that liminal case, there's even in principle the possibility, as Donum Veritatis makes clear, that the truth itself could be stirring. It says specifically, it could be stirring the church to reflect deeper on the truths that it has always held, the meaning of what it's taught.
Yes, exactly.
You cannot write that off in principle. We have to return to the determinate actual judgments here.
Exactly, which is I don't consider myself a dissenter. Dissent would be where you say, well, what the church teaches about eschatology has just been flat out wrong for
Right.
2,000 years. And we're just going to roll all that back and get rid of it. And now we're going to teach this new doctrine. It's not that. That's
Right.
not what I'm saying. What it means, the deepening means a deepening understanding of where perhaps we haven't completely understood our own determinate truths completely and properly, and we need to deepen them. And so I would say, as a Catholic, yeah, hell is real, it's eternal, but we don't have to believe people go there. It's to be distinguished from purgatory, and there is no post-mortem conversion, perhaps, but we have to look very closely at what that means. Now, with regard to the development of doctrine, I would say this too. You said something very important, and that's why I think Dei Verbum in Vatican II is very important.
Mm-hmm.
The church is nothing more than, in some sense, we're the people of God, but also the body of Christ. And the church has simply one function, which is to bring Christ to the world. And I'm going to be very Balthazarian here and say this. The deepest metric of truth in the church is the cruciform Christ. The metric of truth for adjudicating the tradition is the Lamb who has been slain from all eternity.
Mm-hmm.
Balthazar makes this point in Theologic and other ways. Gospel of John, we have beheld his glory. We know it to be true. And what is truth and glory? It is the cruciform, resurrected, ascended Christ. That's the metric of truth. Therefore, I talk about not a hermeneutic of continuity or reform. I talk instead of the hermeneutic of kenosis. And what I mean by that is that we, as ressource-month thinkers want to do, we reinterrogate the entire tradition, which is what Vatican II was up to, is reinterrogating the whole tradition with a different lens and a different eye. And so I would say, let's reinterrogate the entire tradition from the perspective of this hermeneutic of kenosis, with the metric of the cross of Christ as our adjudicating factor, our bell cow for determining what are the distortions that have entered into the tradition and which are not. And I would say, using a hermeneutic of kenosis, one of the distortions that has entered into the tradition is precisely this forensic, juridical notion of judgment, as tote board, ledger board judgment from a judge who is like a human magistrate. And so anyway, I just tossed that out there, and I'll give you we really have to wrap this up. I know there's probably a lot of viewers going, no, we want to, oh, geez, we don't want to leave here thinking Chapp's a heretic. I hope I'm not. But anyway, Jordan, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we really do kind of have to sign off here.
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for this. There is so much more to talk about, to think through.
Yeah, one of the things we didn't talk about is how this changes our concept of God in some ways, in very beneficial ways. But anyway, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, and that's sort of relevant to the last thing I would say is, I think it's important, like you say, when you read a book like David Hart's book or Tom Talbot or whoever, and it's a case for universalism in a certain way, and it's extremely rigorous, and there's philosophical arguments, there's exegetical arguments, and so forth. I think that's all useful. That's theology at work. It's what we have to do. But also, I want to make this final point, which is that, at least for me, I'll just speak for myself on this. The formal argument for a universalism, say based on the transcendental good or about the necessity of freedom, needing to eradicate ignorance in order to be truly free, I think that's all good and true. But it is formal in the sense that it's not. This is a pattern of thinking, and for me, the universalist, one of the deepest sort of motive in it, isn't just that God as qua good, qua the beautiful, the transcendent, is sort of necessarily by the very structures of our being pulling us towards him, although I think that's true. What it's a sign of, that formal argument, it's a sign, to put it in more like evangelical speak, it's a sign that God has not created anything that he cannot understand and he cannot get to. And that's where some people ask me, like, where do you get this certainty or certitude? Well, I mean, by all measures, if you look around, it seems like everyone's pretty screwed up. And people do things all the time that they know is wrong, etc. Right, and me too. Right, number one. But but it isn't. The certitude does not rest on any of us or this current state any more than my certitude in the resurrection rests on the fact that that dead bodies don't seem to be getting up and walking around hardly ever, right? And if you ask
Yeah.
me how will it be, I don't exactly know. There's no abstract theory of how a body is resurrected. That it will be, that I'm certain of.
Yeah.
But my certainty doesn't derive from the how of the process of what will be. It derives from true hope, I think, based and rooted in faith, which is a kind of certainty. But it's this existential, personal one, this trust. And so I don't know how God, I can't even imagine how God will get to certain people, including myself. I can't even imagine. I mean, isn't conversion a sort of miracle anyway?
Yeah.
And so it isn't that. That's what makes this a little different from like a formal abstract theory in eschatology, is it isn't simply, oh, well, here's the mechanisms, here's how the human soul works, here's how the post-mortem state works, etc. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, it is the conviction that God will not be confronted in anything in creation, even in fallen creation, that he's going to say, I don't know what to do about this. I don't know how to get to that person. And I think that's where it becomes a sort of evangelical belief. And no, I wouldn't say this is the dogma of the church. It isn't. But it's a sort of fervency that says, I don't think God will fail to get to every last soul, because he is infinitely resourceful, infinitely willing, and infinitely compelling, and infinitely free, I would say.
Yes.
So, yeah.
No, I agree. And nor do I buy the notion. In other words, in order to buy the notion, the infernalist idea that there are going to be many or some eternally suffering in hell, in order to salvage some concept of the infinite goodness of God, because he knew from all eternity when he made creation, he had, as Hart points out, he had to have the final end in view. And part of that final end in view was the realization then that some are going to be lost, and he creates anyway. What that means, in order to avoid saying that God has now willed something evil, is that those who are being lost, that's not an evil. That's actually a good. That in some way, if we truly understood the divine justice and all that it demands, then we would, and once we do, we will see why it's entirely fitting that those people are damned, and that it's actually good that they're damned. And so that's why when we're in heaven, even if my daughter or my wife or my parents and my siblings are all in hell, I'm not going to be sad, because I'm going to be happy. Oh, well, of course they're in hell. Yes, they're in hell. What a great thing. They're in hell. All right. Now, as Hart points out, at some point, now you're using terms like justice and good very equivocally. Like,
right.
That would mean that God's sense of justice is not analogically related to ours, but equivocally, that it means something so radically different from what we mean by justice that it beggars the imagination.
And then here would be a nice example, and I know we're going to wrap up, but of where you can turn this around if you just do a different kind of speculative work. You know, I can take the Augustine Thomas's line about us rejoicing at the tortures or the suffering of the damned.
Yeah.
If I take my perspective that I would like to work with and say, you know, one reason for that is because what I'm going to see in hell is my old stupid self being destroyed, and the guarantee that I will never return to identify myself as that will bring me joy, and I will praise God for it. And so, you know, formally, I agree. Materially,
so that brings us right back to your theory about the old self being in hell. So, well, anyway, let's wrap it up here. There's so much more we could go on and say, but really, we've been going now for about an hour and 45 minutes or so. So this might be my longest interview. My interview with Cyril O'Regan was pretty long, but this one rivals that. Jordan, thank you so much. I know we'll probably get tons of email calling me a heretic.
Direct them to Dr. Chapp, please.
Yeah, send all the bad emails to me. All right, thank you very much for listening, everyone, and thank you to Dr. Wood. Thank you.